Thanks, Anne. And thanks so much for having me today. Happy to be here and provide this overview on this project. So my name is Cara Nassar. As Anne mentioned, I'm a transportation planner with the Maricopa Association of Governments. I started here almost 5 years ago. And one of my first projects when I started was actually writing a white paper to kind of just get a sense of what was going on with EVs in the electrification world. And since then, we've kicked off this project. And so naturally, I've stepped into that space as project manager for this project. It was one that I was really excited and eager to get started on. And we're about wrapping the project up right now. So I'll kick off and just start with an overview, what we're trying to accomplish. So ultimately, we want to prepare our region for an electric future. And that's not just EVs. We kind of thought that that should encompass more than just EVs. However, the focus in this plan has certainly been largely on EVs. It's a hot topic lately. We wanted to develop a range of recommendations and strategies to support regional electrification readiness across the region. That includes things like assessing the current future state, defining strategies and roles and associated responsibilities for implementation of those strategies, identify strategic funding opportunities, and ultimately set a regional framework for transportation electrification. So here's just a quick overview of what our schedule looks like. We kicked off in September of last year. We had 3 member agency stakeholder workshops throughout the project. Our member agencies largely drove this process. So I just wanted to make sure to highlight that. And then ultimately, we're wrapping up the plan right now, and we expect to be done shortly here, either by the end of the June or a couple weeks into July. So I wanted to just touch on the mission, vision, and goals quickly. These were, again, developed by our member agency stakeholder group. We had a couple of workshops with them to really zero in, but we want to get this region ready and ultimately coordinate across the region to prepare us for a transition towards zero emissions transportation. We wanted to be coordinated about this and strategic, so we really put a focus on bringing our stakeholders along, and ultimately they drove the outcome of what the 4 goal areas are. And these were arrived through discussions. We had in-person meetings and really rich discussions around the table, and just the concerns and issues or things that were going on that we heard of. We settled on the goals of air quality, equity, economy, and readiness. So one of the most important things in this plan was understanding the barriers to EV adoption, and these are not all unique to this area. We did some digging around in a plan review and some best practices we took a look at. So we identified as barriers these top reasons: the cost of EVs compared to internal combustion engines, a lack of charging infrastructure, and a lack of EVs on the market, which can sometimes be thought of as a chicken egg because they kind of can play off each other or influence one another. As we have more vehicles, we need more charging, and vice versa. And also a lack of dealer knowledge about EVs and a small EV used car market. Other barriers we identify include that vehicle batteries only last so long. So there can be some range anxiety associated with owning an EV, and that's getting better over time, but sometimes people will worry about that, and it can be a barrier. Charging can also take time, which can be a barrier for some, but it's important to note that most charging we know occurs at home. It's just not always possible for everyone. So also most EVs are sedans, so there is a little bit of a limitation if people want trucks or SUVs or crossovers, things like that. There's just not really that many of them on the market lately. And finally, up until very recently, gas was viewed as relatively affordable, and that, for many is a pinch point. They might not think about the other implication about switching to EVs, but they're starting to feel the pinch at the gas station. So they're thinking about these things now in relation to that. So now I'll switch to barriers to EV infrastructure deployment. And we found more EVs are needed to make installing fast chargers profitable. That's kind of that chicken egg thing I was talking about earlier. There's a little bit of a lack of awareness of charging stations and how people can find that information. The charging speed can be an issue for some service providers and customers. They want to get in and out efficiently, which can require DC fast chargers, but these require considerable utility infrastructure. There are industrial connections that are needed that increase the cost of the power, and they increase costs basically for everyone. So that just can be another barrier. And finally, there are charging system gaps, especially in rural and underserved communities. And we really need to find ways to fill these gaps to create a complete charging network. So as part of this study, we did a lot of projecting. And one of the things we wanted to look at was different rates of EV adoption growth to kind of start to lay the groundwork to understand what we need to be ready for in this region in the future. So we projected out to 2045, and we had 3 different scenarios that we called the low growth, moderate growth, and aggressive growth scenario. The low growth scenario matches the national average, which is actually considered low for our region because we have a high adoption rate compared to the national average in our region. So this scenario sets a 40% passenger vehicle sales and 15% pickup truck sales as EVs. And you can see in the chart on the left just kind of what those numbers look like. Our moderate growth scenario sets 50% of all passenger vehicle sales and 20% of pickup truck sales as EV. This better accounts for the additional support for EVs and charging infrastructure that we have in our urban areas, including Metro Phoenix and the MAG region. And finally, there's an aggressive growth scenario that we looked at that set 60% of all passenger vehicle sales and 25% of all pickup sales as EVs. This is definitely attainable, but more aggressive. It would require our local agencies and stakeholders to take more actions and steps to promote and support EVs through things like incentivization or infrastructure deployment, more aggressive infrastructure deployment. So this is just future charging infrastructure needs according to each growth scenario, just to give you a closer look at the types of charging that we needed. We did kind of look at this in depth and break it out to have an understanding of the types of chargers to fill all the needs, because different chargers, as many of us probably know, fill different needs. So our current charging demand, we determine using an EV Pro Light tool that is out there from the US Department of Energy. This tool can estimate the magnitude of infrastructure needs to support any number of EVs in any state or urban area. Our default assumption is that all drivers can charge their EVs at home, or the default assumption of this tool. But this proportion we actually reduced to 85% because we do have a significant population that lives in multifamily housing, and that presents a unique set of challenges because they are going to rely on shared and public chargers. We also use the EV Light tool to look at load profiles related to different types of EV charging, and we were able to project the needed load capacity in terms of the utilities and energy needs. So we also wanted to start to identify or create a sort of siting plan. And so we started looking at all our goal areas, and we came up with data sources and metrics based on key indicators for each goal area. We assigned points to these key indicators based on natural breaks and the data distributions. We then aggregated these scores across these key indicators to derive a single score for each goal area and census tract. And we apportioned the total number of chargers allocated to each goal area to census tracts based on the census tract's contribution to the overall score. So that was our methodology. And so what you see here is the top 10 census tracts most in need of public level 2 charging port scoring across all goal areas. And what I wanted to point out here was that we did this in each goal area and then combined them all. And what we found was that the maps actually did kind of coming out looking a little bit different. But ultimately, through discussions with our stakeholder group, we found that all the goal areas were relatively important. And so the decision of where EV chargers might be placed or needed could be affected by these goal areas, and rather they're important to a specific municipality. So there could be some changes here. But ultimately, we have a heat map that you can see a good distribution of need across the region. And we just wanted to at least highlight the top areas to start in accordance to the 3 goal areas, which is that dark red that you see. So I also wanted to touch on kind of the draft strategies that came out of this effort. So we identified our barriers in some areas of need. And then ultimately, one of the big goals of this plan was to come up with strategies that we should be thinking about or implementing. And so I'm not going to run through all of these in detail, but I wanted to at least put them up on the slides just so you could kind of see the breadth that we have. But I'll run through the objectives and just highlight a couple in each. So for example, reducing ozone pollutants and improving health, which ties back to our air quality goal. Things like implementing zero emission fleets, adopting air quality actions that are related to EVs, updating policies for charging and getting chargers into the ground, measuring access to charging from an equity standpoint and continuing to monitor that. This one. So we also wanted to increase access and boost affordability. So things like using community input to help design solutions and listen to the community and understand from their perspective if there's gaps or challenges for them. Retraining the workforce. We recognize there's a really big need and kind of lack of education and knowledge for workforce that can support this thing. For example, we are low on electricians, and that's also not unique to this region, but we're going to need people that have that training to support these efforts. Catalyzing industry growth by illustrating best practices, promoting activities that create consistency and customer experiences, leveraging funding opportunities, communicating funding opportunities. That's something that we've tried to do a lot for our member agencies, developing a coordinated regional approach so that we're not duplicating efforts, and we're also helping each other to support funding in a way that makes sense and can play off of each other. Incorporating EV and charging infrastructure or electrification terminology into planning efforts, supporting funding mechanisms that accelerate the deployment of charging. Optimizing the use of the grid, deploying infrastructure effectively and communicating the benefits and opportunities of electrified mobility. So I have draft on all these. I just wanted to make the caveat that we're still refining these a little bit. We had a partners meeting a little bit back, and we're refining a little bit based on their input. So we've identified some funding opportunities. And when I say some, I mean a lot. We have a large chart that we've included in our report, but I just kind of wanted to touch on the ones that we zeroed in on as, from our perspective, maybe the ones that we could chase the best as the MPO and use to really help support our member agencies in their efforts. So we want to seek additional state funding through state-led programs, directly fund member projects with our regional carbon reduction program allocation, and pursue key federal funding opportunities. So I think many of us are probably familiar with the NEVI program, which would help us build out our corridors. The CRP funds, we've already received a portion of these funds, and currently actually at MAG, we are working on a funding strategy for those funds that would ultimately complement NEVI. and we'll be working with our elected officials to create policy for how they want to go about distributing those funds. But there may be a strategic opportunity there to leverage some of that to help support the deployment of infrastructure. And as far as pursuing key federal funding opportunities, we identified 4 key opportunities. It's that CFI funding. They have the corridor and the community program. So there's an opportunity for us to help build out these AFCs while also advancing investments in our Justice 40 communities and multifamily housing areas. The low and no emission bus program, which is anyone that operates transit fleets in this region is eligible to chase. I know Phoenix got one a couple of years back, but there's more opportunity there to help fleet transitions. We've identified CMAQ funding, which ultimately supports projects that reduce emissions, but these can be used for things like charging stations, fleet vehicles, and heavy-duty construction vehicles. And finally, there's an airport improvement program. And through that, we can support vehicles and equipment transitions and the airports, which tend to be, at least the Phoenix airport, and is in a densely populated area and could have significant impacts on the surrounding air quality. So I wanted to make sure to highlight that we did do collaboration and outreach with a member agency stakeholder group. They were really the driving force behind this. They helped us to develop our goals and objectives and refine our goals, and ultimately informed and refined our strategies. And then a couple of weeks ago, we had a partners meeting as well. We were proposing some strategies that we recognized that we really were going to need partnership in implementing. And we wanted to make sure that if we were putting those things out into the world, that we touch base with some potential partners. So we brought some people together around the table and had a really rich discussion about the strategies we were proposing. And there was a lot of excitement in the room. I'm sure maybe some of the people here today, perhaps, but I think there is just a lot of opportunity for partnership to actually start implementing. And ultimately, we want to coordinate again so that we're not duplicating efforts across the region and that we're being smart about the way that we're implementing this plan. So for our next steps, we are, again, as I said, over the next couple of weeks to a month or so, finalizing that strategic plan. We plan to take it through our MAG committee process for acceptance by the MAG Regional Council. And we're still continuing to just look for opportunities to foster partnerships.